Hi, it's Arjun. For the last month of summer, we are aiming to produce a series of hopefully short, though I know famous last words, videos that highlight key lessons from the last 30 years of what we're calling perpetual transition in the energy space, with an aim to offering hopefully some insights on the go forward view. Now, energy transition itself as a term has become quite loaded of late. It typically refers to the idea that we are transitioning away from fossil fuels into, for some reason, only renewables within some arbitrarily short time frame like 2050. We do not agree that that version of energy transition is either on track to happen or would be desirable from the perspective of human prosperity. But that does not mean nothing is changing. And in fact, over the course of our 30-year career, a lot of stuff has happened, and we have little doubt that the next 30 years will not look like the last 30. The macro has changed, sources and uses of energy have changed, sectors and company strategy have changed, business models have evolved, we have new technologies, we have new key regions to focus on. And as a result of all that, the stocks and sectors that have worked have also evolved and changed over time. Things are constantly transitioning, nothing stays the same. To reiterate, we do not subscribe to what most people call energy transition, as we expect all forms of energy supply and new technologies to grow in the decades ahead. But under the hood, energy markets are constantly transitioning, and we do wish to better understand the direction the world is headed in. Now, today's video will be the first of at least 2 or 3, maybe 4, that will focus on 30 years of perpetual transition in energy. This week's video is going to start with the energy macro. Next week, we plan to turn to corporate strategy and sectors and how they have evolved over the years. And in other videos, we'll look at geopolitics, policy, and the environment. So I want to start with one of the macro areas, in this case, oil demand, and how that has transitioned really over my 30-year career. And you go back to that, my career started in 1992. You go back to the 1980s, mid-80s through really the mid to late 90s, Japan, Europe used to both be important contributors to oil demand. And it's something we as oil analysts used to actually spend time on. The Asia tigers and the tiger cubs were the key growth areas. The tigers were Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore. And the tiger cubs were Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines, if I have that right. And really, oil demand was all about clearly the US, which has remained a robust area, but Europe and Japan and the Asia tigers. That's what it meant to cover oil and try and get oil demand correctly. And obviously, you look at today, you look at the last 20 years, that has not been the focus for oil analysts. China was below the radar, especially in the 80s and 90s. It was growing, and you'll see that in a subsequent slide. But their supply demand was reasonably balanced. If you go back to the 90s, this is only a few years after Tiananmen Square. And I think a lot of that history, it just wasn't the focus of analysts to focus on Chinese demand. The Asia financial crisis, which happened with the Thai baht devaluation, I want to say it was August of 1997 and continued into 1998, was a seminal moment for the kind of focus on the Asia tigers and the tiger cubs. They clearly went through a little bit of a downtrend, growth adjusted downward for these countries, and I'll go through that in a second, but it really was a critical juncture. And at the time, we were also seeing evidence that Japan and Europe were slowing, some demographic issues, and there was a big question: what is the future of oil demand? What will it be like if the Asian tigers went through a bubble and peaked, and Japan and Europe are rolling over? And of course, what happened in 2002 is China joined the WTO. Now, when it first happened, I think we knew it was important, but no one had the type of robust, hockey stick trajectory to either China's economy or oil demand that turned out to be true. So we actually went through, I'm going to say, like a 5 or 6 year stretch from the Asian financial crisis to really the start of the super spike era in 2004, 98 to 04, where you had all this turmoil and uncertainty. Japan and Europe receding, and of course they quietly have faded away in terms of their importance to oil demand. China not yet ramped up, and lots of questions on the health and durability of the Asia tigers and the tiger cubs. I want to show the evolution of oil demand over this sort of important 15 to 20 year period where we transitioned away from Europe, Japan, and the Asia tigers into China. So 3 lines here. The blue line is Europe and Japan. The purplish line is the Asia tigers, just the tigers, the big 4. And then the red line is China. We're looking at the share of global oil demand growth ex the former Soviet Union. Now, ex FSU is important. The FSU was collapsing, so demand was collapsing, so was supply. And it was important in that era to adjust your demand growth to strip out the Soviet Union. That's probably better discussed in a future video that focuses on geopolitical turmoil. But it's hard to remember, especially if you're a more recent analyst. But Europe used to be about a quarter of the growth rate, Europe and Japan, a quarter of the growth rate in oil demand. We used to go visit the Japanese refining companies. We used to go visit clearly all the European oils, but not just to understand they were mostly NOCs at the time, but to also understand the outlook for European oil demand. Look at the Asian tigers. They clearly peaked in terms of growth in the early 1990s, almost 50% share of demand growth. And of course, you see here the crash after the Asia financial crisis. And they did rebound, but at a much slower growth trajectory for much of the super-spike era. And you can see the fading of Japan. China was not irrelevant. I don't remember ever talking about China early in my career. It clearly was growing, though moderately relative to the more recent period. And of course, it was in the 2000s where it really started to take off. But if you look at this picture and take away some of the lessons, we have shifted from Europe, Japan, and the Asia tigers being core components to how we think about demand to China. Today, we're faced with the question of what's the outlook for China? What about their demographics? What about their shift to EVs? And oh, what about you? And so you're facing just a different set of the same types of questions. And our view, it's for previous videos, for a future video. We think oil demand grows for the foreseeable future, but we've had these transitions before. We've had to work through them. It seems like we may be going through one right now. I think we're going to come out fine on the other side as we did in this prior transition. So part of the reason why I remain optimistic about oil demand is to actually the same lessons that we learned from the Asia tigers and tiger cubs, I think are going to apply to current areas like China. But let me go through the numbers. So the left is South Korea, both per capita demand, the blue line, and the absolute oil demand on the right axis, the purple line. And it's the same equivalent graph for Thailand. But a couple points here. First, you can see the real hockey stick improvement in South Korea from the mid-'80s to the mid-1990s. And they got to a pretty healthy level of economic growth. And keep in mind that once they peaked just before the Asian financial crisis, they did not get back to that level until it's really almost 15 years later. And now their demand has continued to march higher. And South Korea is the example of a country, this is basically my lifetime, that has gone from poor to middle income to rich. Congratulations to South Korea. I think there's a similarly important lesson to learn from Thailand. The first is they've gone from poor to sort of lower middle income by the time the Asian financial crisis hit. But you look at this, after the Asian financial crisis, their demand was flat for 5 to 6 years. We're going to call that the first plateau. It then marched higher in the 2000s, but as oil went from $20 to $100 a barrel, that put a lot of pressure on the Thai economy. And they again went through a second period of flatness from, it looks like 2005 till about 2011. And now their demand has continued to march higher. And you just think through the Thailand example. Yes, it's a small country, but they've had 2 periods where their demand plateaued. It is entirely possible for countries to go through periods where it flattens out. But there was nothing about Thailand being either at 3.5 barrels per capita during the Asian financial crisis or 4.5 barrels per capita during the $100 oil super spike era period that would lead a Thai leader or the Thai economy to perceive themselves as being, quote, rich. They'd not gotten to South Korea levels of prosperity, or for that matter, Europe or the United States. And their demand continues to march higher. There is still, I think, a long way to go in Thailand and some of these other Southeastern Asian countries. South Korea has arrived. The others are still in the process of arriving. But think about the lesson. You can go through periods of plateau demand. And I know today, if we do that, all we're going to hear is, oh, peak demand is here. And yes, there's more opportunities to displace oil demand with things like electric vehicles and so forth. But it is a challenge to take the large quantity of people, the other 7 to 9 billion people on Earth, from poor to middle income to rich status, without using all forms of energy. And I think the same way that Thailand is inevitably marching higher, we're going to see that in places like China. We're clearly going to see it in India, the rest of Southeast Asia, and hopefully ultimately Africa as well as Latin America. I want to shift to some of the other areas. I'm going to be quicker here. I think there are areas to come back to, but other areas where the energy macro has transitioned. And what are the lessons from it? So look at like natural gas. 30 years ago at the start of my career, you could have made the call that natural gas demand, either in the US or globally, was going to grow faster than oil demand. The reality, though, is, and that was a correct call. That's actually what happened. But that did not mean you only wanted to be a natural gas producer or exposed to those value chains. And the periods of time where it's been great to be a US gas producer, other periods of time where you've had oversupply and so forth, where it hasn't been so great. The LNG business has generally been a better business. It's for bigger companies. It's a little more stable, a little more tied to oil prices. That's generally worked out for the super majors who have participated in LNG. But I think that lesson applies today in the power sector, which looks to be on track to grow at faster rates than oil. And even we asked the question, should traditional energy companies look to participate in power? And I think there's a little bit of a lesson in natural gas. I think you have to be careful. I think you have to figure out what is the business model that works in this different macro environment. So it's always good to be, it's usually good to be tied to businesses that grow at faster rates. But I think natural gas, the lesson was you want it to be in LNG, perhaps in petrochemicals, especially cheap domestic ethane and feedstock gas here in the US, or you want it to be in the midstream space. And it wasn't necessarily great to be an upstream producer per se, just because that was the faster growth area. Another big shift macro-wise in my career was in the early 90s. When my career started, everybody knew without a doubt, the US is mature, you want to go overseas, you want to go offshore, and that's what a lot of, especially the larger companies did. All the super majors meaningfully sold out of their domestic positions, and you had the shift overseas. Now, there were some folks who bucked that trend. XTO Energy, I think, is the best example, buying US properties, originally in gas, also in oil from the majors and others. And they were, of course, one of the big winners when it turned out shale gas became a thing in the US, and then shale oil became a thing. It's just an example that where the conventional wisdom goes, it can be right, but it can also be very wrong. So who can buck the trend? In the last decade, we know it's all and only been about US shale oil, and especially about the Permian Basin. And I want to be clear, we love the Permian. We think it's still got quite a bit of running room for especially the leading companies. But in terms of being the future area, history would tell us what worked last cycle, the area to be in. It might still be a good area to hold if you're already in it, but what is going to be that next area of opportunity? And we don't know the answer. And I think that's going to be really the differentiator between the next big winners, the equivalent of a future XTO, versus those just trying to hang on to what worked last cycle. Biggest change in my lifetime has been the shift from US import dependence to now being an energy superpower. We are an energy superpower in oil and gas. We should be, in our view, in new energies going forward, or at least we should aspire to be. This has really been a dramatic change for the better. I've talked about it before. I'll talk about it in the future geopolitical video. Huge macro change. The change cannot be understated in terms of how important it's been. With new energies, big lesson over the last 30 years is that it's never been easy. Okay, you're often told, hey, we can easily transition. It's just a matter of political will. All this new stuff is low cost. That is absolute rubbish. And I don't even know how that's a question. So like, you go through new energies 20 years ago during the Super-Spike era. At Goldman Sachs, I was asked to cover the ethanol producers. I think they all went bankrupt except for Veriten ended up selling to Valero, which in fairness to Valero, I think has turned out to be a good deal for them. But every other one went bankrupt as far as I remember. I was asked to cover cellulosic ethanol, which I don't think anyone ever went public. Cellulosic was always going to be 5 years away, kind of like hydrogen. And of course, today we have zero cellulosic ethanol. Reminds me a lot of hydrogen cellulosic ethanol. And point with simply, and even today, I'm recording this today on a day that SunPower has declared bankruptcy. Now, solar has worked out in terms of growth, but I'm not sure it's worked out in terms of at least some of the US and European companies. Where are our major new energy companies, despite having had some growth? And our point would simply be, there's a big lesson here that while the specific technologies changed, it's not easy. It's never been easy. And no one should be telling you it's going to be easy going forward with new energies. I think the final point we just make on the 30 years of perpetual transition is that energy is far more complex and nuanced than the simplistic good versus evil, all or none. You either drill, baby, drill, or just stop oil. It is far more complex than the extremist perspectives. Everyone needs to push back on both extremes and really understand really the core drivers of energy, far more complex and nuanced than what I think many people are led to believe. So what can we take away from all of this looking forward? I think the first and overarching conclusion is primary energy demand, economic growth, and human well-being are 100% correlated, full stop. It is perplexing, it's baffling when people tell you by using more energy, we're destroying the planet. That is absolutely not true. People are living longer and having the smallest number of people in poverty as we've ever had in the history of the world. We've seen population growth explode to the upside as the world has become richer. It has been undeniably a great thing to use more energy. It goes one for one with human flourishing. As someone said, it's the heart of presidential election season. It's the economy, stupid. And it's not clear why we have to keep learning this lesson, but the economy, that core driver of energy demand, is why we use energy, and it is the only reason we use energy. It is a hierarchy of needs for everybody, for the developing world, for the rich world, for presidents, as we noted last week. Is energy available and reliable, first and foremost? Ideally affordable, though you'd sacrifice affordability to have availability and reliability. There's no question about that. Secondly, is it geopolitically secure? And then thirdly, is it environmentally friendly? That is the third objective. And trying to push it up to the top of the queue will never work. If you're a diehard climate activist by somehow listening to this video, you have to solve for everyone being energy rich. It is a hierarchy of needs for everybody. And when you're richer, when your economy is richer, when you as an individual are richer, your ability to deal with environment is significantly better. And your ability to adapt to a changing climate is certainly better as well. For companies and for investors, it is a question of risk-taking. What is the next opportunity? Not what was the opportunity that worked last cycle. What is going to be the future low-cost resource, new technology, or new business model? Now, this is a little bit of a tease for what we're going to emphasize next week, but the macro is constantly changing. So should business models. So should the area of resource advantage, if that's the case, or whatever technology or infrastructure pursuits you have. It is all going to evolve going forward. It's about looking out over the next 30 years, not looking backwards at the last 30. So I'd like to end this video on a personal note. And in the spirit of 30 years of perpetual transition, we're going to gear these on a personal notes to that same topic and talk about my own transition. We'll start with career and family, because it's interesting that different sort of stages of family formation have coincided with my different career stops. So my career started in 1992 at Petrie Parkman in Denver, and then I was on the buy side at JP Morgan Asset Management. And this picture here is I was at JP Morgan. I want to say it was July of 96 or 97. That's Steve Enger in the blue shirt without the jacket. And then three buy-side friends who were all buy-siders. I hope they don't mind me saying their names. Patty Gilfie of US Steel, Steve Kerbo of Putnam, and Tony Montano of TIA Cref. And then myself in the blue jacket. And you can see I did used to have a full head of hair, long since gone, though you can see, I think I was 26, 27, starting to recede. So some warnings that that hair was not going to last forever. But this is post-college. My parents totally took care of me, paid for everything through college. But once I graduated, and to their credit, once I graduated, I was on my own. So this is that period, pre-wife, pre-children, where you're building your career. I'm loving energy. I love being independent. I love being able to support myself. And for my first paycheck at Petrie, I've been able to support myself. You then get to JP Morgan to Goldman Sachs. I got engaged between the two jobs, got married a few days after I launched coverage. And the Goldman career was the start of building the family and building my career to a new level. My first big call was an upgrade of Murphy Oil before they discovered the Kike field on Block K. That was when I upgraded the stock the day my daughter was born. Different story for that. In 2003, I'd had a number of good calls to be managing director. That's the year my son was born. In 2006, we're 2 or 3 years into the Super-Spike era, big macro call for me and the team. And I made partner in 2006, the year my youngest child was born. So family and career have gone together. But as I've said, wife deserves full credit for being basically a single parent during the Goldman years. You then fast forward to 2014. It's now the 10-year anniversary of basically my dropping coverage and retiring from Goldman. And I dropped coverage in June of 2014. Oil was still $110 a barrel. And it was 5 months before that fateful Thanksgiving meeting that caused oil to roll over and kind of be at $50 a barrel for the next 5 or 6 years. But that transition away from Goldman to board and advisory work, it also coincided with my kids being in middle school and high school. Total blessing. Best decision I've ever made career-wise was to move to board and advisory work and get to see my kids. That was awesome. Best decision I've made. You now fast forward to today, and we're in our fourth transition personally, where we've got a new cycle. Kids are leaving home. Everyone's in college. One's even out of college. And I've joined Veriten, my friend Maynard, and all my other colleagues at Veriten. And we'll see how long this cycle lasts. But it's been I think a very fortuitous, a very lucky marriage of these family evolutions with the career evolutions. And I know how lucky I've been both to have such a great family, my parents, and now my existing family, but then to also do it while covering the energy sector. I am as lucky as you can get amongst those lucky 1 billion people. Thank you.